Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Tim Ball. Dr. Tim Ball is a climatologist who has been teaching and educating people for 40 years in climatology. He has been a professor. He's written thousands of articles. And one of the interesting things about Dr. Tim Ball is that he is interested in the context in which climate happens. He's also studied crop production, the survival of animals in the wild and animals in general. And we have had him on many times, actually. We did a piece with him on the complexity of ocean exploration, examining peer review with best-selling author Gavin Menzies, author of 1421 and 1434. Our first climate show called A True Inquiry into Climate and Weather with Robert Felix and Joe Dalio. And we have done other shows with him. But today I've invited him on because I have a concern, like many of you, about the glaciers melting. And while we've had geologists and climatologists and meteorologists and people from every area of climatology on, I started to read some articles on this and I got very nervous. And I invited Dr. Tim Ball to help set the record for this, how we can understand glacier melting in context. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Tim Ball back to It's Rainmaking Time. Good afternoon.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks for the opportunity.
The first thing is that many of us who love the Earth and are concerned about our planet keep seeing these articles on the internet and on YouTube. And the thing that concerns me is somehow I came in touch with this site, cc.rsoe.hu/index. I'm going to leave a link up after we get the show to the public. But several of the articles were the following: extreme weather and climate change, leaking Siberian ice prompts methane warning, Austrian glaciers shrink, and melting Arctic ice threatens a quarter of the world's population. Now, when you click into these on this site, and there are different sources like RIA, Novosti, Planet Ski, AP, LA Times, and TVN like Nancy, z.co.nz, what you get are videos of rivers, of streams, of the sun being out, and people talking. For me, it seems all very convincing if I hadn't done a year and a half of due diligence about climate. Now, I'm not saying it makes me a climatologist. I'm not saying I'm fit to be in the conversation at the highest level, but I do have a frame of reference now that I didn't have when I was a global warming advocate or believer, if you will, a year and a half ago. So I would like you to give us the frame of reference for how we evaluate whether what we're being told about the melting Arctic ice or the Australian glaciers shrinking, how do we deal with this? How do we know if it's true or not?
Okay, very, very good questions, and it speaks to what is being exploited here. The first thing is people's fear. That's embodied in the lovely story about Chicken Little, the sky is falling. And of course, then you have on each side the Cassandras, that is the doom and gloom, and then you have the Pollyanna people. And what we're trying to do, and what you're asking about, is how can I come down somewhere sensibly in the middle? Because we know there are events that occurred, catastrophic events, and we also know that there are some very positive things, but there's a tendency to only focus on one side of it. And so the articles that you mention in that website are actually focusing on the doom and gloom, the Cassandra, and so on. And so that fear factor is the first thing that's being exploited. The second thing that's being exploited is people's lack of understanding. And it's not just understanding about the science, but it's also lack of knowledge or understanding about the planet. A Canadian Prime Minister once said Canada's problem is too much geography and not enough history. And I think that applies to the world, but I think it's wrong in that we've got lots of geography and lots of history. The problem is people know very little about either one. And I noticed a story today out of England where students, there's severe criticism of the teaching of geography in their high school curriculum. And and they say, oh, because they're not being taught where different places are in the world. You know, the old standard, you've got to learn a few facts before you can start debating them. So the lack of understanding. And the more obscure but potentially threatening something is, the more they can play on it. Now, the reason I'm making those comments, Kim, is because when I say to people, well, what's wrong with global warming? Because all you hear are the negative sides. In other words, the Cassandras have the platform, and there are a lot of positive things for global warming. And one of perhaps the most nasty attacks I got were about an article I wrote for Canadian consumption about the benefits of warming for Canada. And they didn't want to hear that. Now, it's partly fueled by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we've talked about. They say warming is proven and it's going to continue, and then they look at all the negative impacts of it. They don't look at, well, what are the positive things? So we need less heat energy to heat our homes. We need less fuel because our cars are not idling, and on and on and on. And so you're only hearing one side of the story. But as I said, when I ask people what's wrong with warming, they can't think of it. They can't respond to it. And then after a couple of minutes, they come out and say, "Oh well, the sea level is going to rise." And that has become the sort of standard response. Well, why is the sea level going to rise? Oh, well, those glaciers are going to melt. And that's why in Al Gore's movie, he made such a big part of his movie about the melting glaciers and about the sea level rise, and then the computer images of the lowlands, the Calcutta, the delta of the Ganges, Florida being inundated with water, and so on. And those images, of course, are frightening to people.
Very frightening.
Well, of course, you can joke about it. You can say, well, you know, New York's going underwater, and we could see that as urban renewal. But it's, you know, I mean, to step aside from the flippant for a minute, it is frightening to people, and it's partly frightening because, and again, most don't know this, but they intuitively sense this. People tend to live in floodplains, in flat areas, particularly along the ocean's edges. If you take the Ganges Delta, the Nile Delta, the great deltas, or the lowlands of Europe, even in the U.S., the Mississippi area. And it's because those are areas where the soils are fertile, they can produce the food they need, but they're also high-risk areas because of flooding. And when you list the climate disasters of the 20th century, the top 20 of them, 11 of them are droughts, but 5 of them are flooding. So 16 of the 20 are related to this problem of too much water or not enough water. And the flooding one, of course, is a big threat. So that's why it's become such an issue. But of course, it all goes back to the glaciers and the ice, and as I said, people's lack of understanding. Now, just to illustrate the point, and we'll get into the dynamics of ice and glaciers and so on. Sea level has been rising for the last 10,000 years. And it's risen very dramatically because about 15,000 years ago, sea level was 500 feet lower than it is today. And imagine that, looking at the world, just lower the sea levels by 500 feet. And what does that do to the English Channel, the Baltic, and all around the world? You can think of the change to the land-water ratios that would have. So the sea level has risen. The English Channel wasn't there 6,000 years ago. And in fact, the archaeologists find some of their best sites of ancient Britain out under the North Sea, which have been inundated. And so the sea level's been rising. Ironically, the rate of sea level rise has reduced in the last 1,000 years and has reduced even more in the last 200 years. So the rate is decreasing. Now, why has this happened? Well, 20,000 years ago, there were massive ice sheets on the land. North America, almost a third of the continent was covered with an ice sheet, larger in area than the current Antarctic ice sheet.